Well, hi, everyone. It's Don Davis here, your host of Supply Chain Secrets, and I'm introducing this week's episode. This week, it's exciting. I'm filming in our beautiful New York office here in the World Trade Center. So if the background looks a little different, not New Jersey, this time it's beautiful New York. And in this show today, we interviewed Pete Mento. And Pete, if you don't know Pete, great guy. He's done a lot of different things. He's been the head of supply chain at Wayfair. He's served on a lot of different advisory boards, maritime. He does some consulting and has a great perspective on the industry, and I thought was a great guest to talk to. And we start off the show after we talk about his background what are some of the changes he's seen from a shipping industry and how have things evolved over the past 2 years? And I thought he had some great insights there. And then we start to talk a little bit more about what can carriers do to avoid being seen as a commodity. He mentioned that had changed, but what are the things from his perspective that can help differentiate carriers? And me as a former carrier guy, I'm always interested in those kinds of thoughts. And then we got into his perspective on the relationship between shippers, carriers, and NVOs. And we talked a lot about like how that's changed and how that could change going forward, because I think the last 2 years has put a lot of stress on that. But we spent some time talking about that. Then we start talking about the market, short-term and longer-term outlooks to give a sense of how things are looking. And I thought it was some great perspective there. And then we start to talk about obstacles for supply chain and what are the most important pieces that we need to fix. And I thought Pete had some great points there. And then we start to talk more about technology and how technology can help solve some of the problems. What role can technology play and what kind of things are top of mind for Pete? And then we talked about the lack of visibility in the industry and talked about standards and how the lack of visibility really lends itself to a lack of standards. So I thought there were some pretty interesting insights there. And then finally, to wrap up the show, everyone's favorite part, where our guest gets to ask me all the tough questions. And Pete gave me 3 tough questions, which was a lot of fun. So I really enjoyed it. So I think you'll enjoy the show. Give it a listen, everybody. And I hope you enjoy it. So we'll be on again soon. So thanks for listening.
You are now listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast with Don Davis.
Well, hi, everyone. My name's Don Davis. I am the Senior Vice President of NVO Experience here at NYCHEX and former executive of Hapag-Lloyd and CMA CGM. And I'd like to welcome you to another exciting episode of Supply Chain Secrets. Today, very special guest, Pete Mento, first time on the show. His background is he served in many roles. He's been the global head of supply chain at Wayfair, a committee member of the National Shipper Advisory Committee, vice chairman, U.S. Maritime Resource Center. So you've done a lot of different things. And Pete, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure. It's nice to be the interviewee for a change and not the interviewer on a podcast. It's nice.
Well, listen, usually at the end of the show, we like to turn things around after I spend 40 minutes peppering you with questions. You get to ask me a question, anything that's on your mind, or you could just say like, nah, fine. It's totally up to you. But welcome to the show.
All right.
And for our guests that may not know you, if you could spend a minute just talking about your background and introducing yourself.
Sure. I started my career as a merchant marine officer. I attended Maine Maritime Academy. I'm a proud alumni of Maine Maritime Academy. I graduated with a degree in marine transportation, and the intention was to be a deck officer on container ships. I was really bad at every aspect of that lifestyle. So I chose to get off of ships as quickly as possible. At the same time, I was pursuing a career as a stand-up comedian.
Really?
So in the early 1990s, I was a national touring act. So for about 3 years, I worked clubs all over the country. I wrote for television and movies. I lived that life, and I did pretty well at it. But I saw what financial success meant at the time, and it wasn't going to do for me what I hoped it would. So I applied to a bunch of graduate schools and law schools. I got in Harvard and pursued a degree in trade theory and government, and I needed a job. So I got to Boston, and a wonderful man named Marty Gillespie and his boss, Benno Bartoli at Panalpina, gave me like the dream job for a grad student. I worked all night. So I worked from 4:00 until midnight, I think it was, routing air shipments, cutting airway bills, doing customs entries, just whatever they needed me to do. And I was by myself except for one guy in the warehouse. And that was just a fantastic way to break into freight forwarding. I ended up doing sales. I went to AEI for a while. And what eventually happened was I became a customs house broker. And that's kind of when I found myself, and worked for a number of very large tax firms, eventually becoming a partner, and helping companies to recover tariffs, deal with customs compliance audits. In my career, my team and I have recovered over $1 billion in tariffs and fees from all kinds of customs jurisdictions. But really, my passion has been helping people to break into foreign markets, deal with the regulatory challenges associated with it, and to not pay the tax man in the most efficient way, but also staying within the law. Very fortunate to have worked for some incredible organizations like Expeditors and C.H. Robinson. I was an executive with both of them. And up until recently, I was with Wayfair. We had a round of significant layoffs about a month ago. And so I'm back with my own consulting gig and trying to figure out amongst the different offers I've already got what I want to do next. So it's a nice situation to be in right now. Very fortunate, and we'll see what happens next.
Yeah, that's great. And what a terrific background. And, when you talked about AEI, I've always wanted to play a game with a bunch of people who've been around like us for a while. And, talk about like name that NVO, like where did AEI go? Where did Brits go? Where did all these other ones go? Because it's changed
Yep.
a lot over time. Just a lot of consolidation in that space. But anyway, it's kind of funny. So let's start with just supply chain. And from a shipper's perspective, there's been a lot of changes. I think change is really accelerated through COVID. There was an environment that seemed stable, typical prior to the pandemic. And then the COVID hit, and then everything kind of went crazy. And I think today you're in a different place, I would say. Maybe things are starting to normalize. But what's your perspective on that journey of how things have evolved over the past 2 to 3 years?
Really, we went from an environment where the ocean consumer, the person who was really buying transportation services, had done an incredibly effective job of commoditizing ocean rates, looking at individual carriers as being very little more than buying a dozen eggs or a gallon of milk. A big floating box taking your stuff on a boat ride was the same no matter who it was. And try as they might, the ocean carriers, in their degrees of intercompetition with one another, were having a hard time distinguishing themselves from one another and establishing some sort of normality with regards to capacity. And a few things happen when COVID happens. The first big thing is you have this immediate drop in the desire of companies to buy space. And that was mostly out of fear. But if you went around everywhere, myself included, every economist on the planet, including good old Dr. Mento over here, was super wrong on what they thought was going to happen to the world economy. Instead of everybody just hitting the brakes on spending, we kind of went crazy, and we continued to buy, we continued to resupply, we continued to buy things that we didn't have. And it caused a real drive into purchasing and to finding space. So this environment of carriers were very smart at that point to slowly bring back in capacity, to understand where that capacity could be done so in a way that was going to be the most effective financially for them, and then to maintain those levels of capacity in order to give the best possible outcomes to their shareholders, which is good business. Unfortunately, for those of us buying it, it was just a big old bag of suck. It went from really, really, really low rates, the $1,500, West Coast, $2,000 West Coast rates, to I was regularly having friends of mine calling me and saying, "Are these people serious? They want $22,000 for a 40 out of China right now." I'm like, "Yeah, the market giveth, the market taketh away, my friend." And then we're now in the situation where the global economy is about to make some serious corrections. Example of that is China's home buyers, so their homeowners are the world's single largest asset class. It's bigger than the U.S. stock market, all of it together.
Wow.
And they have a 40% drop off from last year's purchasing. So they're buying 40% less. And the value of those homes is beginning to drop precipitously. Add to that the fact that lending now is next to impossible to get a hold of. Interest rates are beginning to go up. Small businesses are beginning to fail because of the way that orders are going. And that global recessionary situation is really starting to affect the big, the little, and the in-between in China. The global recessionary pressures that go with that are going to start shifting where the cargo needs to go. It's going to start shifting the way that raw materials move from one place to another. And it's really going to affect the American retail sector. I would not want to be one of these companies who agreed to relatively high container rates for a 2 to 3 year period thinking this party was going to last. And there's a lot of them, that were buying 40 footers to the West Coast at the $6,000 to $7,000 rate for the next 24 to 36 months, some even higher, that are going to be looking at rates in the 2000, 25. Some people are saying less. Good for you. I've tried to do that math. It's pretty tough. And knowing that the spot market is going to be effectively much, much below those large purchasing rates that they did, it's going to cause chaos again in the marketplace. And that chaos is going to create opportunity for some companies, and it's going to create a lot of buyer's remorse for others.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think it's been a pretty wild market condition. I think things have changed quickly. And, one thing you saw, I guess, starting a year or so ago, is that you saw companies chartering ships that had never chartered a ship before and doing different things, and, how that plays out.
Yeah.
It's anybody's guess. I mean, I think one thing for sure, it's been very difficult to predict. So what happens next, nobody knows. Hopefully there is some stability, because I think everyone is looking forward to that. But I want to dig into one thing you said, and we'll talk about the market in a minute. But you talked about, like, prior to the pandemic, carriers had effectively felt like they were a commodity, and they didn't really do a good job of differentiating themselves. And I guess me as a carrier guy, this question comes top of mind when I hear that is, what kind of things do you think a carrier can do to differentiate themselves? Like, what in your experience have been those things that say, this is really truly different, where everything from other carriers might feel the same?
Well, you're seeing that evolution happen now. So for decades, right? I mean, at least a decade, these ocean carriers were just trying to literally stay afloat. That great business line, can we just stay afloat? I mean, they were just trying to keep their vessels operating because their returns and their margins were relatively low. And then because of an unforeseen pandemic, they got flush with cash. And it's been, for me, fascinating, because I am an unrepentant nerd, to watch what the different carriers are doing with this incredible abundance of cash. You've got the Maersks of the world, who are really diversifying themselves as a carrier, a forwarder, a customs house broker, software as a service provider, getting engaged in every single aspect of international logistics, and looking for ways to better integrate, penetrate, and retain their client base, and try to find ways to push out those NVOs, push out those 3PLs, who really do nothing but dilute their profit margin. And then I look at the Hapags of the world, who are looking at physical infrastructure. They're trying to think of smarter ways to reinvest in the actual capacity of their vessels, technology. They haven't spent all that money. I think they're being relatively intelligent in saying 2 or 3 years from now, there's going to be a lot on the market that might not have been. And we had gone from a period of how are we going to deal with all the scrubbers and dealing with the environmental issues and policies, to we got money coming out of our ears now. So how are we going to do it in a way that's most effective to us? It's been incredibly interesting for me to watch. So how are they distinguishing themselves? Many are becoming forwarders that happen to have ships, and others are becoming ocean carriers that suddenly have the ability to invest in better operations than ever before. One High is an example. They've suddenly got a lot of cash. Are they going to change the size of their ships going forward? You look at SIVA and what's going on right now with them and their relationship. Why am I blanking? CMA?
Yes.
CMA SIVA? Yeah.
Correct.
And how they're integrating those two incredibly diverse, very different pieces of business. But then MSC, Hapag-Lloyd, very, very different. Evergreen, very, very different. Business as usual, with a lot of money to invest in the future. So as a consumer of that, it's going to be fun for me to watch what happens next. For carriers, I think that you're about to see maybe the next 50 years is being decided in the next 24 months.
Yeah, that's really super interesting. And I think you're right. I mean, there's so much evolution in the space between different strategies. And now you're starting to see, forks in the road in terms of what carriers are trying to do. I mean, MSC just announced that they're starting their own air cargo service. So you have ocean carriers playing in the air cargo space, ocean carriers playing in the forwarding space, ocean carriers involved with the infrastructure. They've always been involved in terminals, but I think it's interesting to see how this plays out. And I think the good news is for shippers is that you probably are going to have more options than you had before. And maybe you're leaning in one direction or the other, but it just depends on those services that you need to procure. But in talking about, shippers, carriers, and NVOs, I mean, it's been a very volatile 24, 36 months. And how would you describe, or what's your perspective on the relationships between shippers, carriers, and MVOs and how that's played out over the past few months?
Wow. I think, there's this awful line in history: the strong do what they will and the weak accept what they must. And there was a period of time when the consumers of logistics knew that they could take their freight to just about anybody and they could beat a carrier into submission to save that extra 20, 30, 40, 50, $100. And now the tide's turned when I personally had conversations with carriers who told me contracts are contracts, but we both know there's nothing you can do about it right now. And there was a period of time where we just had to sit back and eat our cream corn and deal with it. Now that's the tide is turning. And you have consumers of freight who are into 24, 36-month contracts. And I fully expect these ocean carriers to hold people accountable to them. Doesn't mean they won't negotiate them, but they're going to hold them accountable to them. And I think we're going to be in a better position now as an industry. I pray that we're in a better position now as an industry where the ocean carriers don't look at us as an adversary and we don't look at them as an adversary either. I took a lot of heat in the media over the past year for saying that as shippers, we really need ocean carriers to be profitable.
Yeah,
We need it. We need them to make money. We need them to have a healthy return on what they're selling us.
for sure.
And if we don't go into that relationship with that attitude, we're going to have, as a guy who went to sea, ships that aren't safe, sailors that aren't safe. You're going to have unreliable service. You're going to have carriers that aren't investing in making things better. We want them to be in that position. So we can't go back to the old days of saying to ocean carriers, it's not about relationships. It's not about reliability. It's not about schedules. It's all about price, because we're just going to be in the same situation again.
Yeah. No, I've said it before on the show and I'll say it again, is that I think carriers, it's good for the industry for carriers to be profitable. And as somebody who spent quite a bit of time on the carrier side, when you have these razor thin margins and you're doing handstands to stay solvent, it's a precarious place for the carrier. But when you talk about things like service delivery and you want quality of service, it's just hard to execute on those things because at the same time, you're trying to maximize profits and they're so thin that, first of all, it's a very asset intense business. It's not cheap from a container supply, from a repositioning, from a vessel management, from fuel costs. There's all this cost headwind from a carrier. And if they're not able to do things like invest in technology or invest in infrastructure, you're not going to see improvement in service. And now I hope we're at a point where things start to change. And to your point, I hope there's an environment where it isn't like, okay, this past 24 months felt bad. So now things are changing. So now we're going to go, the shoes on the other foot, and now we're going to behave in a certain way. I think it doesn't feel productive to do that. I mean, I think there hopefully is a world where, shippers, carriers, and MVOs can work together and say like, okay, there's lanes for spot cargo and short-term, midterm, long-term, whatever those rates are, that'll sort itself out. The market's going to dictate that. But by having different like partitions around rates and whether I have a tolerance for a floating rate or a fixed rate, I mean, that could play out. But it feels like people are having to make bets. And if you make a bet, it's so punitive. And it really shouldn't be that. It should be, this. I understand the components of the decision, and it doesn't feel like something I'm going to regret 6, 8 months, a year later. But that's just one guy's perspective. Yeah. But I think we agree there.
No, we definitely agree there. Unfortunately, I think there's a lot of people who can't wait for the shoe to be on the other foot and to go after these ocean carriers and get theirs. There's a lot of vengeance and a lot of bad blood that's really happened where people felt victimized. I mean, this is an industry of things that are out of our control. Ocean carriers have absolutely no control on the cost of bunkersea right now. None. They have no control over zero COVID requirements in China. They have no control over what's going on with the economic forces in Europe, what's happening with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, with Putin's invasion of Ukraine. I mean, they've got nothing to do with all of that, but those all have significant influence on the way that they operate. So how can we blame them for how that affects their prices? We can't, but we're going to hold them accountable to it, even though maybe that's not the best business decision long term. And then ocean carriers look at us and say, I got to stay profitable. I've got to make money. But how are people making money on an ocean container where the value of the stuff in it is $30,000-$40,000, but you're paying 25 grand to move it?
Yeah.
It's pretty brutal.
Yeah. And I think it's doesn't look great when you see, low levels of on-time performance and high profit margins from carriers. It just feels like, wait a minute, there should be some correlation there. To be fair to the carriers, I think it was an environment where, a lot of companies were desperate to get things on the ship, and they would say like, okay, I know the rate's $4,000, but I really need to get on the ship. Can I pay you more? Can I pay more? And it, sort of drove up the price too. And, ocean carriers have never seen prices like this before. I mean, I never thought I would see a 5-digit price, let alone something in the 20,000s. But it's interesting to see the way it unfolded. And I hope we can just get to a point of saying like, okay, let's figure out a way to work together. We have stuff to move, and how do we do it at a fair price? One that's going to be compensatory for me as a carrier, one that you could tolerate as a shipper. Because the other thing is, you could argue from a carrier perspective, it's like, aha, see, I can charge a higher price and still move cargo. So, does it have to be, that 950 rate that we might have saw 10 years ago? And I think those days are over. But anyway, it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds. But on this topic, when you start to think about the direction of the market, I think, there's probably a short-term view and a long-term view. And when you think about that, do you have any perspective on, what's going to happen, let's say now through the end of the year, and then what the next couple of years look like?
Well, absolutely. There's going to be a return to service. That's for damn sure. And reliability. That's got to happen. I was on a call with one of these private equity firms that, slings me my hourly fee to talk about what's going on in the world, and just going over numbers. And they said, let me get this straight. So over the course of the past 3 years, prices have gone up, 8, 10 times? I said, yeah. But reliability and getting it on the ship has gone down like 40, 50%. And I said, that's being generous. And then schedules they've never been worse? I said, yeah. And customers have never been more unhappy? No. And they said, okay, so name me another business, another product where it's never been less reliable. Customers have never been more unhappy with it. And the service has never been more crappy than it is now. But the price for it has gone up 1,000%. I said, I can't. This is unsustainable. And I said, welcome to the party. Like, of course it is. But we're not dealing in a normal environment. I hope you're doing well in these unprecedented times. I mean, this was not a normal period. And now we're going into another abnormal period. We're going into a global recession that is going to affect every corner of the globe. And with that, you're going to have severe price drops. And you're going to see, hopefully, if these ocean carriers can all toe the line and keep their capacity, all working together to keep capacity to a certain level, not that I would ever allege that, you're going to have those rates at the, somewhere between the 17, 25, and then starting to go up again a little bit. But it just takes one carrier, Don. It takes one carrier to break ranks. And once that happens, it all falls apart. If one carrier says, I've had enough of this crap, I'm taking my shot, these rates will go through the floor again.
Yeah, it's so interesting because there has been a pattern of behavior, I think, over time where you've seen like, as you say, like there's one carrier and there might be an overreaction to match that carrier. And, it's hard to say like what percentage of the market is that really impacting, and do I need to do that? And like I said, I hope that, things start to change, because I do think there are some unknowns in the future. I mean, I think, okay, things have started to normalize this year. There wasn't really a peak season. What happens towards the end of the year? Or do we start to see the normal pattern as we go into Chinese New Year? I mean, there's some speculation there, but I think carriers are going to start to control their capacity. I mean, they want to be profitable too. And I think that there is some sentiment from a carrier is like, look, if my ship's not full and we're not making money, then why am I going to sail? Because it costs a lot of money to operate a ship as well. So, and you could argue and say like, well, hey, you signed up for this at this rate level, and you should be able to move my cargo. And I think it's a tough thing, but I think also the enforceability of contracts becomes an issue that either party has been able to not perform and not have to pay a penalty. And I mean, that started to change. I mean, we at NYSHEX have obviously seen that this is starting to change, and there's some different thoughts around it. But I'm hoping we can get to, again, a point where both parties can kind of come together and say like, maybe the durations are different or maybe there's some flexibility there. But I think there's other things we can do as an industry to try and innovate and think differently about contracts in order to say, okay, there's some certainty. Because one of the biggest pain points in my life as a carrier has been just this overbooking phenomenon, and that you have to book 20, 30% over your capacity just to land at 100%.
Yeah.
And the problem with that is sometimes you get it right, sometimes you get it wrong. And it's just because you're not really sure who's going to show up. Is somebody holding space here? They're negotiating other rates and then they go somewhere else. And it just creates all this inefficiency in the industry. And I think, to some extent, there should be a tolerance for that. But to have 30% overbooking feels irresponsible. But then again, if I book at 100% and then I'm sailing at 70%, then I have an underutilized asset. And what do I do there? So I think it's a complex problem. But what are your thoughts on that?
I had a number of professors at Maine Maritime Academy that I'll never forget. And one of them was Captain Weeks. So Captain Weeks, Charles Weeks, he was the chief mate, I think, on the Savannah, which was the first nuclear cargo ship. Like he brought the USS United States back in. He was the world's foremost expert on the accident of the Titanic. He was a very interesting character. I don't know if he's still alive. I can't imagine he would be because it was a long time ago. But he taught our cargo classes. So he taught stability and he taught dangerous goods and all those classes. And the first class he taught us for marine cargo was a ship only makes money if it's full and down, boys. A ship only makes money if it's full and down. And, we're all freshmen at the academy and none of us know the pointy end from the round end. We're like, what the hell is he talking about? And he'd say, a cargo vessel owner only wants to be underway if his ship is full of cargo. If it's full of empty containers or if its holds are empty, it's not doing anybody any good. So the situation is, how do we make sure there's just enough space so that one container's sitting on the dock? And as people who make money working on those ships, you're supposed to be rooting for that situation. So I understand that. And then as a reseller of containers, as an NVO, same situation. I want to have just as many customers where I've got that one customer who's maybe not the most important, who's like, my stuff going on the ship, I will get you on the next one. Just trust us, It's the same situation, Your ship only makes money when it's full and down, and you're not making money if you're over promising and people don't show up with their cargo. And now every single factor that makes that ship more expensive is getting ridiculous. People working on those vessels is never more expensive. The situation with the energy prices around the world is just preposterous. And we have everything going in one direction in North America because nobody wants to ship to the West Coast because we're terrified of a strike. So, ship only makes money when it's full and down. And how many blank sailings is it going to take to make sure these ships make money?
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting. And I think even before the pandemic, blanking was something that you started hearing more and more about that. I think starting in like 2018 and 2019, it started to really take off. And then obviously it's more commonplace today. So you can see that there is this capacity control. And I think, frankly, it's necessary because, again, as you point out, there's a lot of cost headwind facing a carrier. And it's like, what do I need to do? I try to need to be full. But when you think about a shipper's perspective and you think about the supply chain, what would you say are the biggest obstacles in terms of the supply chain as going forward? And do you feel like some problems are really top of mind as the most critical to try and solve as you look towards the future?
Yeah, I'm going to give you three that I think are the most critical. The first is having a diverse supply chain. One of the most shocking reports that came out this week, Apple is making a significant number of its iPhone 14s in India. Who would have thought,
Yeah.
to serve the world outside of China. Having a diverse supply chain and being able to manage your supply chain amongst different geographies is difficult and complicated. And everyone thinks, well, if I can find a manufacturer and I can find a supply chain that gets me my raw materials, I'll be just fine. And that is not the case. All the people that went to Vietnam and Cambodia learned real quick, not a lot of ships, not a lot of aircraft. So if you want to have a diverse supply chain, that means diversity in carrier options as well, and diversity in options to move your goods. Got to be mindful of that. The second big thing that I think we should all be focused on as an industry is environmental policy. And not so much as, I am a hippie. Don't even get me started, right? Barefoot, tree hugging, dolphin petting hippie. But beyond all of that, the people that I serve now have a mandate from their shareholders that they want to see them lower their carbon footprint. And you're going to see NVOs, vessel operators, BCOs, all making this demand that there is a lower carbon footprint. And I think that as we see the new vessels coming into service, older ones are going to be pushed away. It's going to cause a capacity problem. No one's talking about that. And the overall supply chain, using rail intermodal more intelligently, double stacking on rail, trying to find ways to be more engaged that way. Our customers are going to demand intelligent ideas out of us that give them a more verdant and environmentally sound. I work with a company called Fleet Zero that's building entirely electric vessels right now. And the way they're doing it is genius. They're going to put one into service next year. Very proud of the work they're doing. It's one step in what's going to be a really long battle against it. Working on a diesel ship, I can tell you, we burn a lot of fuel. And the third thing is technology. Of course, this pandemic, man, the amount of money we saw poured into Logitech. Eric Johnson over at the JLC, I bet he probably broke his fingers typing every day on the next digital solution that came out of nowhere. That poor guy. This desire of companies to be able to pull data, make intelligent decisions about how they're going to move their goods, it's going to eventually end up pushing back into carriers. The ocean carriers, the air carriers of the world, I think whether they want to admit it or not, they're quite a ways behind the people they serve when it comes to technology. They need to get up. They need to get up there and really start investing in it in a meaningful way and not constantly be addressing that, but leading the way. I'm getting a little concerned that they're always the ones answering the call rather than being the ones that are making the call to make better digital and technology decisions. They better watch that or someone's going to come disrupt their business.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you mentioned technology because I think those are all great points. But on the technology point, I think that's really been accelerated with things that the money you've seen in the industry. I think it's an interesting industry when you see that it's the billions of dollars involved there. And so you've seen that there's more VC money being poured into different companies. And there's a lot more activity around that, which I think that, again, is good for the industry because when there's razor thin margins, no one's making money, then it's like, well, at least the carriers aren't making money. Then it's not as an attractive for these VCs and technology. So I think that's been a great development. And I think, as you say, it's been way behind. So hopefully things can start to accelerate. And when you think about things from a tech standpoint and you think about the supply chain, what kinds of things do you think are missing and where do you think the greatest opportunity for improvement is?
Wow. The single greatest opportunity for improvement is in collaboration. I get, somehow somebody gave me this title of being a futurist, and I'd love to know who it was so I can smack them. But I don't know. I keep predicting crap. But here's the world of logistics, supply chain. Aside from maybe babysitters and lawn care, I can't think of a less homogenous group of how we do business. Everyone does something our own way, and then we look at our processes and say, this is a very special patented process that we do here. No one else does it quite the way we do. And we don't try to find ways to do them together. We need standards. We need them desperately. And one of the greatest things that could happen is if we all agreed on one standard process, one standard digital model, and then built off of that. Just one basic digital infrastructure that everyone else could use as a model and a standard to build off of. There's plenty of opportunity for innovation to be based off of that. But we're constantly, as an industry, we're always addressing the needs of the world around us. As a customs house broker, man, I know more about women's shoes and lingerie than any man in my position should probably know. I have learned more about pharmaceuticals. I have learned more about the aerospace industry. I have learned more about things that I never thought I would, just because I've had to serve those industries on a dime. You have too. And because of the way that these markets change, technology has to change right along with them. And that forces us to constantly bring in new technological ideas. The standards and the basis for that doesn't have to change. We need to pick some standards and work off of those so that we can all begin to kind of read at least off of the same paperwork. It just hasn't happened.
Yeah. I mean, I completely agree with that sentiment. And I think that, part of the problem with the industry is that there's just a real lack of visibility, that it's hard to see how anyone's performing. It's hard to get data. There's different amounts of data. Some companies are good at providing data, others aren't. And when I say companies, could be NVOs, could be carriers, but there's all these different levels of availability of access to data. And
Yeah.
by not really having great tools to provide visibility, I think it's harder to have a standard because no one can see it. So you can't measure it if you can't see it. And if no one's paying attention and we don't all have the same way to look at it, then, I can make my own metric and say, yeah, I'm blah, blah, blah for this. And then, who could dispute that? Like, how do you even look at that across companies? And so I think there's just a real lack of visibility and transparency that hopefully we could start to get there. But, my sense is, again, if no one can see it and no one can say, yeah, I can look across companies and see how this is working, it's hard to create a standard. But what are your thoughts on that?
There's a great business model that they, when you do your MBA, it's called the Oz principle. You are the perception of other people to them. So, I get into an argument with my fiance and she tells me I'm a moron and explains to me why. And I sit there and I say, but none of that's not who I am. But to her, that is exactly who I am, because I'm the moron that puts my wet towel on the bed. I'm the idiot that, leaves empty cans of soda water everywhere in our house. I'm the guy that, and to her, that is her perception of me. That's the perception, And you just brought up this great point that perception is the truth. So whenever I did a QBR with an ocean carrier, they'd come in with their own statistics and say, here's our on time. Like, whoa, 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 whoa. That is not a realistic depiction of our relationship, my friend. This is my perception of you. And I'd like for you to know it. And if you want me to have a better perception of you, you need to base your actions on my perceptions. And say, well, then show me your statistics. I don't have any. I don't have anything. I don't have any standard across my business to compare Maersk to Hapag to CMA to MSC to anyone, because I don't keep track of you that way. So I'm sorry. I should have gone off the handle like that and called you all those names. Let's get back to your statistics. It's really on us to come up with a way to standardize those metrics so that we can have that intelligent conversation. Because right now it really just comes down to whose data do you believe in? And that's no way to build a relationship and fix things.
No, I agree. And to your point earlier about collaboration, I mean, I think this is an opportunity to try and do that. And I think, there's enough momentum in the industry that there's probably some different companies that can align together. But I think as a community, as a shipping community, that there's work to be done there, because I mean, nothing's more frustrating than, to your point, of sitting in a meeting and comparing data, either one set of data that you don't believe in or two sets of data that look different when you're talking about the same thing. Then what's the conclusion there if we're both looking at the same thing differently? It doesn't really become effective at that point, and it's hard to make progress. So, I'm optimistic that in the next few years, hopefully sooner than that, I would say maybe in the next year or two, we can come to some solutions that everyone can agree with, and again, adopt some standards that we can all point to, so we all have the same level of accountability, visibility, and we see some better actions around performance.
Yeah, if I can just address that. So I was in a bizarre situation when I was at Wayfair, in that I was a BCO. I was also kind of an importer, kind of, because we were doing it on behalf of our suppliers, but to us, it felt like they were family. That was one thing about Wayfair. We have, although I'm not there anymore, they still act this way. We have a very positive attitude about our suppliers. We want the best for them in all ways. So I worked with the highest levels of customer service from the ocean carriers. And to me, that relationship was always very transactional, very operational. It never felt strategic. And that's not their fault. So I would be in these meetings with my superiors, and they'd say to me, why aren't they driving ideas? Or why aren't you driving ideas? And I'd say, well, I need to drive those ideas. But right now, it is so brutal. It's like a knife fight trying to get things done at the ports and all the rest of it. The last thing that people have time to do right now is to truly focus on strategy. So what I'm hoping comes out of this pandemic, and as things maybe normalize in our industry, like if one of these ocean carriers was crazy enough to call me and say, you want a job working for us? And say, well, first of all, you can't afford me. But if you wanted me to come work for you, the thing that I would do is I would completely change the customer relationship experience for BCOs, where there would be we would drive innovation to them rather than the other way around. No one knows their business better than we do. So I would do everything I could to bring great ideas to them, because honestly, if they choose not to do it, don't say we didn't tell you. Don't say we didn't bring it up. It was there the whole time. But they've been in such a survival mode for the past 4 years. Cannot blame these ocean carriers for not doing it.
Yeah. Well, and you'd like to see that if there is this return to profitability for carriers and that, they have this cash that maybe they can invest in some of those resources and create some things. And again, the point we were talking about earlier about having a differentiated product, I think that's one way carriers can totally differentiate themselves from each other, to say we're providing a different level of service, a different experience. Because as you say, sometimes it feels like a knife fight, wrestling, like, pick your metaphor, but it feels like it's just too hard to get things done. And it's like, we're just trying to move freight. Like, why does it feel so like there's so much friction to do that?
Oh yeah. Hey, whenever I would go to a party, and I'm around all these glamorous actors, and because I still have friends in the industry, and one of my best friends is an orchestrator on Broadway, and I go to these big parties amongst all these pretty people. I'm like, what do you do? And I'd say, I put furniture on a boat ride. That's what I do. I'm like, what do you mean? I'm like, just what I said, man. If I try to explain it any farther than that, your eyes are going to glaze over. You're not going to come back and talk to me. It's a little more than that, maybe, but not all that much more than that. I see bigger problems in this industry than just that. I'll bring up a really big one. To me, it's what's going on right now with cyber. If you want to know the biggest single problem right now in our industry that no one's talking about, it's that we have the world's single largest objects moving all over the planet. And to have them taken over by some guy in a cafe with a laptop really isn't that difficult. I have a good friend of mine, Alex Uhanoff, with a company called True North. That's all they do, is they manage cybersecurity. My friend Chuck Forsyth at HDA and PCSE, we're all terrified of what happens when these large vessels, sooner or later, somebody decides that they're going to become the target of a real cybersecurity breach. And that is going to take collaboration. It's going to take the carriers. It's going to take the dray providers, the ports, custom services, the freight forwarders, the NVOCCs, everyone working together to deal with it, because these are scary times. And if you want to disrupt an economy, you disrupt its trade. And to disrupt its trade, you disrupt its transportation. So I'm very concerned about that. And that takes collaboration. And that's something the carrier should be driving down to their customers, not in the other direction.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, that would not be good for anyone, really. But, you think about supply chain and economies and the shocks there. I mean, we saw the effects of COVID, right? And that was, and there was a pandemic, obviously. But now you think about like this sort of cyber attack, it would be very detrimental and very difficult for the industry to cope with that.
Yeah.
Well, Pete, we're pretty much at time, but we're at a point in the show where I like to turn it over to the guest. I've been peppering you with questions. You've done a great job answering them, but now's your time to turn the tables. And if there's anything you'd like to ask me, feel free, go ahead. Let me know if there's a question that's on your mind.
Well, in my podcast, we end every podcast with Pete's 3 big questions.
Oh boy.
So good luck, Don. Question number 1, what was your first job that actually paid you a paycheck?
Okay. Well, my first job, I was a utility clerk at a grocery store called Butera in near Norridge, Illinois. And I did that for a couple of years before I moved on to I worked at Wilson Suede and Leather and sold in retail. But my first job, utility clerk at a grocery store. So when you had to clean up in aisle 6, I was your guy.
Clean up aisle 6, Don. That doesn't sound so bad, though. I mean, at least you're around other people,
The worst was shagging.
Question number.
Shopping carts was the worst. So that was
yeah. That's got to be a lot of hard work.
That was not fun.
Question number 2, first car you ever owned?
Oh, yeah, first car. Well, it was none other than a luxurious Chevy Cavalier RS. And I want credit for the Rally Sport. It was a stick shift.
Yeah. Hey, man.
So, I was cruising around town with that car for quite some time until I actually crashed it. I hit a parts car because I was looking for my tennis racket in my back seat. And I learned you shouldn't drive and look behind you. So that was a fun thing to explain to my father.
In this business, the number of people who crash their first cars is alarming. I'll just leave it at that. And the third question, which is probably the most fun, if time and space and physics and everything else didn't matter, and old Uncle Pete here had a magic wand, and I could wave a magic wand and you could have any career imaginable. I mean, if I could make you, a 6'8" center for more like 7 feet these days for an NBA team or whatever, what is the one job that you wish you could have done rather than this maddening, insane business that we are in?
I haven't given that question much thought, so I just have to go off my initial reaction. And I think in my house, there's a lot of this Below Deck. There's a show called
Yep.
Below Deck, which is
Yep.
like a cruise ship. And I'd want to be a captain of one of these like luxury yachts. I mean, it sounds like you have to do some youth management, with your crew. There's some like goofy things that happen, but it actually seems like a pretty fun job. You get to see a lot of different places in the world. It's still on the ocean, still kind of shipping, in a way that you're on a vessel. So that would be cool. But, also a way to probably make some money, see the world, and have fun. Those boxes check for me. I would be really excited about that.
Well, in the maritime industry, Don, we say the reason you never want to work in a passenger craft is it's the only cargo that talks and has opinions. So I don't know, man. That'd be a tough one.
Well, good news is that containers can't talk.
They cannot.
So it might make life a lot more difficult. Well,
Yeah.
But Pete, listen, thanks for being on the show. Had a lot of fun. I thought it was a great show, great interview. And for our listeners, don't forget, rate us, review us wherever you find our podcast, Apple, Spotify, wherever you download our show. So thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll be on again soon.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Don.
Thanks for listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast network.